1863. This is Block 9, 1863. All right, so let's have a start. All right, at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of 1863, the Union armies had achieved some successes in 1862, although the Confederacy remained largely unoccupied. In the west, the Mississippi River was open to Confederate traffic. Food and horses that came from Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas could pass eastward to the armies in the rest of the Confederacy. In the eastern theater, General McClellan had pushed General Lee's invasion of the North back, but he had failed to follow up on that and had failed to destroy Lee's army in Maryland. The Battle of Antietam was a tactical victory for General Lee, but a strategic defeat. That Lee managed to not have his army destroyed by the much larger Union army, but had to withdraw from the field and give up that first invasion of the North. 1863's Peninsula Campaign left the city of Richmond, the Confederate capital, as far as it had ever been from being conquered by the Union. The South's will to fight as the new year rolled to 1863 was very strong. The South was still hoping for foreign intervention. 1863 would be the pivotal year. The story at the end of 1863 is very different from the story at the beginning of 1863. So let's see how that happened. We're going to start in the West with the Western Theater of War, and we're going to again zoom in here to one of our maps, one of our excellently drawn visual interpretations of the Civil War. And this is letter A, the Vicksburg Campaign. Vicksburg is a city. Yoink. Vicksburg is a city in Mississippi. Let's kind of associate ourselves with the map. This is the Mississippi River, the mighty Mississippi, the largest river in all of North America. At the beginning of 1863, General Grant from the north and Admiral Farragut from the south had captured most of the Mississippi River. However, this part of the Mississippi River around the Confederate town of Vicksburg still remained in Southern hands. So it was through this part of the river that supplies and goods, mostly food and horses, so important to the war effort, and cotton for clothing, could pass from the western part of the Confederacy, the states of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, across the river to the eastern half of the Confederacy. This is the key to that position. So number one, capturing Vicksburg. If the Union manages to capture this town, capturing Vicksburg and cutting the South in two is a main Union war aim. That if the Union can somehow manage to capture this town on the Mississippi River, they will successfully control the entire Mississippi and therefore prevent trade from happening between the eastern and the western half of the Confederacy. But this town is incredibly well defended. It is not only defended by an entire Confederate army under the command of a general by the name of Pemberton, John C. Pemberton, but it is also protected by the fact that the map does not do this justice. Vicksburg does not sit right on a flat piece of land next to the river. Rising up out of the river is this enormous cliff. And the town of Vicksburg is perched high up on the cliff. And these bluffs surround it, these little dotted lines, are not flat land. They rise up out of the river. So you just put a whole bunch of cannons along here, and you can prevent any Union ships from using the river, and protect, obviously, Confederate ships that are using the river. It's also very difficult to attack this because of this sharp bend in the river. You can't take a ship and at top speed run it past Vicksburg. A ship to go around this bend has to go really slowly. And as it's going really slowly, the artillery up on the bluff would blast it to bits. So it could not be assaulted by ship. it could not be assaulted straight on. You could not put men on the beach and have them charge up to Vicksburg because it's on top of this enormous bluff, and it could not easily be reached from kind of behind and to the south, because if you look at the map, this area here is all swamps. So the Confederates thought that they had a pretty good defensive position here in Vicksburg. And in the spring of 1863, for the North, Ulysses S. Grant is put in command. And Grant launches this audacious plan to take the city. So the first thing he does is, Grant's army is up here. Okay, Grant's army is up here in the north. He takes his army and marches it all the way down the river, all the way south of the city of Vicksburg. 30 miles south of the city, he crosses the river. Now he's on the eastern shore. Everyone's expecting him to turn to the north because he can only supply his army from boats on the river, and mostly from supplies walked all the way down here and then across. So everyone's expecting Grant to stay close to the river. He has to go up the bluffs. There's the swamp. It's going to be a mess. But instead of heading north, Grant heads east, bypassing the city of Vicksburg and bypassing his supply line. His men carried what they need and got the rest from the land around the march. This living off the land would play a role in 1864 in what's called Sherman's March to the Sea. He left his supply wagons behind. He headed overland, planning to live off the land. After 2 weeks, Grant attacks and defeats a small Confederate army under Joseph E. Johnston in Jackson, Mississippi. All right? After Jackson fell, after Grant took Jackson, Mississippi, he turned towards Vicksburg. General Pemberton, assuming that Grant was running low on supplies, and assuming Grant could not keep up his fight in the open country, Pemberton came out of Vicksburg and attempted to meet Grant head-on. At the Battle of Champion Hill, Grant acted aggressively, defeated General Pemberton, who then doubled back and went and kind of hid out in Vicksburg. Grant followed. Now there's not an army here to threaten him, not an army here that's going to come out and threaten him, so Grant can now take his ever-loving sweet time. And what he does is he surrounds the city of Vicksburg. And he puts it under siege. He attacks at first, and you can see kind of the bluff in the picture on your notes. He attacks frontal assaults 2 times. They are pushed back by Pemberton's army, but Grant is easily repulsed. Pemberton is actually ordered to evacuate the city, but he doesn't think that he could get his army out safely, so he decides to hope to hang on. Grant does his 2 frontal assaults. They both fail. Grant settles in for a long siege, even ordering his men not to take any more casualties in specific attacks on the city of Vicksburg. And days turn to weeks. And weeks turn to months. And the army in Vicksburg began to starve. They had plenty of ammunition, plenty of guns, but not enough food. Grant's men dug trenches so they could defend themselves, and they just brought up heavy cannon and started blasting away at the city of Vicksburg. Pemberton's 33,000 men and the 5,000 civilians that were still in the town began to suffer greatly. As the town was pounded, Union gunboats started coming up the river and launching cannonballs and attacking the city from the other side. Life in town began to grow unbearable. Food started to run out. Sickness and disease stalked the men. By June, another Union army came up from Louisiana and kind of solidified the ring. An interesting thing about these troops, about these reinforcements that came up, were largely African American troops, black troops. At the Battle of Milliken's Bend down here, they defeated a Confederate force that was trying to come up to relieve the city. So there's this troop at a place called Milliken's Bend of black Union troops, a Confederate force trying to get to the city, to get Pemberton out, attacks them. They are repulsed. The black troops were not particularly well equipped, but they were perfectly brave, and with the help of Federal gunboats on the river, held their ground. So then these African American troops came up, finished the ring around Vicksburg, and kind of made it so Pemberton in the city had no chance of escape and no hope of getting out. Joseph Johnston over here with his army in Tennessee, trying to kind of put the army together after his defeat at Jackson, refuses to come to Pemberton's aid, saying it's hopeless. There is no way he can attack Grant's fortifications outside the city. So finally, with starvation stalking his men, on the 4th of July, 1863, a day after the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg, Pemberton surrendered his starving army to Grant. Grant is a magnanimous victor. He will be constantly throughout the war. He does not take the prisoners, he does not take the starving men prisoner, but instead paroles them back home. He has them sign a piece of paper that says, I promise not to fight anymore against the Union, and Grant says, go home. But many of them did fight again, and this event ended kind of the last remaining relationships between the North and South. After this event, there was no more prisoner exchanges. If a Union, it used to be at the beginning of the war, if there was 500 Union prisoners and 500 Confederate prisoners, the two sides would kind of get together and they'd flip. They'd switch their prisoners. But this event concerning the parole of the men at Vicksburg, and there was almost 30,000 men paroled, and they were soon again fighting for the South, ended that relationship. And the terrible conditions in many Confederate prison camps, such as Andersonville, were a result of this breakdown of civility, really, and breakdown of communication. So what was the results? The results are fundamentally vital for the Union. President Lincoln commented that the Father of Waters now flows again unvexed to the sea. And what Lincoln meant by that poetic sentence was that the Mississippi River from Minnesota in the north all the way to New Orleans in the south is now again in Union hands. The entire Mississippi River, once again, the Stars and Stripes flies. The South is cut in two. No more could all of that food and horses and supplies from the western part of the Confederacy be brought east to help the armies fighting in Virginia and Tennessee and eventually in Georgia. What's Grant going to do then? He certainly does not sit there on the Mississippi River with his army. He is now going to take his army and should have another map here. Okay, here we go. The South. Part of the South. The southern South. Grant is now going to take his army. Vicksburg's over here. Grant is going to start moving his army into Tennessee. There's already a Union army in Tennessee called the Army of the Columbia. And in Tennessee, in September, outside the town of Chattanooga, there's a place called Chickamauga. And on September 19th and 20th, 1863, an attempt by Union General Rosecrans to push the Confederates out of Tennessee towards Atlanta, Georgia, ends up in catastrophe. General Rosecrans maneuvers his army poorly and left a gap in his line. The Confederate General Longstreet, who had reported down south from Gettysburg, exploits this gap in the line, and Confederate troops pour in behind General Rosecrans. By the time the Union Army reorganizes itself and held off Confederate, follow-up counterattacks, the damage had been done. The city of Chattanooga falls to the Confederates. The Union grip on eastern Tennessee is threatened. The Union can no longer threaten the vital southern city of Atlanta, and the casualties were immense. Sadly, most people today, even people who know about the Civil War, very rarely know about the Battle of Chickamauga. And, I mean, we didn't even go into detail about it here, with this more detailed look at the Civil War. But the two-day Battle of Chickamauga was the second bloodiest battle in the entire war. Only Gettysburg had more total casualties than this forgotten Battle of Chickamauga, which took place right at the very southern tip of the state of Tennessee. It was a Union defeat. They managed to kind of hang on at the end. The army didn't get destroyed, but it was a close-run thing, and the casualties were immense. After the disaster at Chattanooga, General Rosecrans is kind of discredited, and President Lincoln takes General Grant, the victor of Vicksburg, and puts Grant in charge of all of the armies in the Western Theater. And that pretty much means all of the armies outside the state of Virginia were now under General Grant's command. So what was General Grant going to do? And that's number two, what's come to be known as the Chattanooga Campaign, because it took place, how do you like that, around this Tennessee city of Chattanooga. So General Grant is put in command after the disaster at Chickamauga. And the first thing General Grant does is he opens up a supply line between his army at Vicksburg and the remnants of the Union Army outside of Chattanooga at a place called the Battle of Wauhatchie. At the Battle of Wauhatchie, Grant opens up a supply line between his forces at Vicksburg and Chattanooga. So now Grant kind of brings his army into Tennessee. And we're not going to do this campaign in much detail. But suffice it to say that outside the city of Chattanooga, the Confederate forces were arranged in kind of an arc, like that. I'll zoom in on this just briefly. See if I can hold that there. Bink, bink. Okay. The Confederate forces are kind of in an arc around... Let's see if we can see that. There it is. Around Chattanooga. So the first thing General Grant orders is for General Thomas, who is the hero of Chickamauga, he wants to see how strong the Confederate Army is, kind of up on these heights around the city of Chattanooga. And Grant orders an assault pretty much right on the center of the line. And the Confederate forces are so surprised that the Union Army was actually attacking that they fled. That no one expected anybody to charge up these bluffs and attack the army. So now kind of there was Union forces kind of right here in the middle of the line. But that's threatening because both sides of the line can then kind of come in and destroy the middle. So Grant has to now clear the rest of the Confederate line. And at the Battle of Lookout Mountain, letter D, the left side of the Confederate line is cleared. And this is just a battle that's become well known because of the location in which it's fought. That Lookout Mountain is this high hill. All around it, it was early morning, it was all foggy, you couldn't see the top of the mountain, the fog came down kind of around where the soldiers were fighting, and these Union troops attacked up the side of this foggy mountain, kind of at dawn. And it's a confused battle because nobody can see anything. And the Confederates withdrew. So now that Grant holds the center and Grant holds the Confederate left, now Grant has to clear the Confederates away from their right. And that becomes known as the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And in this battle, just the bravery of the Union troops involved is incredible. The Union Army drives straight at the Confederate defenses under the command of Braxton Bragg. And the Union troops kind of conquered or captured the rifle pits at the base of this ridge and then fought their way up to the top. Constantly going up, they had just the bravery of these men is incredible, really. The Union then attempts to kind of do a double envelopment maneuver, but the Confederate General Braxton Bragg realized that, and at the Battle of Rossville Gap, the Confederate troops around Chattanooga were forced to retreat. And they established a new defensive line right here guarding Atlanta. Okay, so that's the Chattanooga Campaign. If you look at the casualty figures, this is a campaign, this is a part of the Civil War that we don't usually remember. And it's probably because it wasn't fought in the East. It wasn't between Lee and, General Lee wasn't involved. It wasn't Lee versus Grant. It was out west. But an incredibly important battle. Tennessee is once again safely in Union hands. The road is now open for a Union attack on Atlanta and the Deep South. And most importantly, after years of looking, the North finally has its great military hero. That all of the unsuccessful generals, old General Scott, General McDowell, General McClellan, as we're going to see shortly, General Burnside, General Hooker, General Rosecrans, fail, and General Grant kind of emerges as the great military hero, the great general that the North has been waiting for. And he is ordered, 3A, General Grant is ordered by President Lincoln, he is ordered to Washington to take command of all the Union armies in the entire country. General Grant goes to Washington and takes command of every single Union soldier in the Army. His trusted lieutenant, his trusted right-hand man, General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, much more about him coming up, is left in command with the orders from General Grant. He says, General Sherman, your next thing to do is going to be to take Atlanta. But by the time that happens, it's already the fall of 1863, and the campaign to take Atlanta is going to have to wait until 1864. So by 1863, at the end of 1863, where are we in the West? The Mississippi River is back in Union hands. Vicksburg has fallen. General Grant then, fresh off his victory at Vicksburg, comes over to Chattanooga, defeats the Confederate army that had won at the Battle of Chickamauga, forces them out of Chattanooga into Georgia, gets appointed commander of all the Union armies, leaves his Lieutenant General Sherman in command with an 1864 mission to conquer Atlanta and the Deep South. And what General Sherman does in 1864 is a good topic for the 1864 notes. But the Western theater in 1863, you have to see two big turning points. One, obviously, is Vicksburg, and the other main thing is the emergence of General Grant as the great military hero of the North. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because what's going on in the most important theater of the war, what's going on in the East? The war in the East, number 3. And we're going to start, this battle actually takes place in late 1862, but it's associated with 1863, so this is where we're putting it. The war in the East starts, letter A, with what's known as the Battle of Fredericksburg. Okay, Fredericksburg, one word, the Battle of Fredericksburg. As we saw in 1862, Abraham Lincoln was beyond angry at General McClellan for his failure to follow up after the victory at Antietam and destroy Lee's army. So he replaced it. He finally had enough of General McClellan and appoints in his place General Ambrose Burnside. And there's Burnside. What Ambrose Burnside gave to the world was that wild, amazing facial hair. And I do feel the need to show you something. You can mock my family. I ask you to note the sideburns on the young man in the white jacket all the way on the right-hand side of this picture. Those are sideburns. And we call them sideburns. I'm not going to tell you who that was. Not me. Those were some pretty rockin' bow ties also, weren't they? Sideburns are called sideburns because they were first worn by General Burnside. And you can see his big old sideburns in that great picture. Burnside's kind of a sad story. He was a competent enough general. He was no great shakes. He was kind of the hard-working kid who's not too brilliant and knows that he's not the brightest bulb in the box, but he works hard, so everyone kind of likes him. And everyone respects him for his hard work. When Lincoln said, "General Burnside, I'd really like you to take command of the Union Army," Burnside's first reaction was, "Oh no, sir, I can't possibly. I'm not a good enough general to do that." And Lincoln said, "Well, you've got a choice. It's either you or Joseph Hooker, another general who Burnside distrusted and disliked and did not think was a good choice to command the armies." So Burnside reluctantly took up command, and he said to President Lincoln, "I don't think I can do this." But he certainly gave it the old college try. So Burnside's plan was actually a pretty decent plan. He was going to make a dash with his army in November of 1862, after regular campaign season was over. Kind of when everyone was starting to settle down for the winter. Burnside said, "We're going to dash as fast as we can, surprise Lee's army before it can react, cross the Rappahannock River near the town of Fredericksburg, and assault Richmond before Lee could put his army together, before Lee could concentrate his army." Once Burnside was in Richmond, he would force Lee's army, which was smaller, to attack him. Burnside kind of wanted to dash for Richmond, get there before Lee could react, and then kind of sit tight and play defense and force Lee to attack him. Because if he was sitting in the Confederate capital, Lee would have to attack. And Burnside knew if he could get Lee to attack him, he could probably win. As you can probably figure out, the key to this entire plan is, can Burnside move his army quickly? I don't want that there. Eek. Move over. Eek. 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 Yoink. Sorry about wasting your time, my friends. Can General Burnside move the army quickly enough for his plan to succeed? I want Mary's height. Just lower this a hair. Okay. Okay. The key is speed. Well, in November of 1862, Burnside begins moving the army down towards the Rappahannock River. Here's the Rappahannock River. Richmond's all the way down there. By November, he's reached the river. The Union Army is on the northern bank of the Rappahannock River. Lee's army is starting to react, but it's hard to pull an army of, 50, 60,000, 70,000 men together and get it moving. The plan is working. However, there was one catastrophic mistake. You got to cross the river. And the pontoon boats that were required to cross the river got kind of lost in a bureaucratic red tape mix-up shuffle. And therefore, the boats that were supposed to get to the river first before the army got to the river first and then sat there. And the commanders were screaming on the telegraph wires, "Where are the pontoon boats? Get them here as quickly as possible. We can still make it. We can still surprise Lee." Burnside, for his part, had to wait. He did not want half of his army to be across and half of the army on the other side, because then Lee could attack him with his back to the river, destroy half the army on one side. It would be a disaster. So Burnside waited. And he's like, "Get these pontoon boats, get these boats over to the river." And what a pontoon is you just get a bunch of boats and you tie them together and you make a bridge over the river, a bridge made out of boats that are tied together. So there, Burnside sits because he's waiting on these boats. And of course, as Burnside sits and waits for these boats that got lost, they came in at the end instead of the beginning. Lee maneuvers his army into position outside the town of Fredericksburg. Lee puts some troops here in Fredericksburg, but he puts most of his troops, and there's some over here. Lee puts most of his troops on this slowly sloping piece of ground called Mary's Heights. And there Lee waits for Burnside. Clearly, Burnside's plan has been compromised. Speed and surprise have obviously been lost. But Burnside feels, well, the army's here, might as well use the thing. And he attacks. Finally, those pontoon boats got there. He sets up a pontoon bridge kind of here, 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 and here. And his men slowly cross the river. First, they fight their way through the city of Fredericksburg. Severe house-to-house fighting leads to severe Union casualties. But eventually the Union troops push the Confederate troops back up into this ridge where General Lee has prepared them. Other Union troops attack over here. You can't see that. There we go. Other Union troops attack down here and initially have some success, but a counterattack by Confederate General A.P. Hill kind of stops that attack cold also. But it's up here along Mary's Heights that the real action is going to take place. It's a gentle sloping hill, Mary's Heights. You can see it in the picture. There's the flat ground, a stone wall, and then this slope going up. That wall that you see in the picture, behind it was a sunken road. So pretty much a soldier could stand up and just aim his gun over the stone wall and fire. Burnside orders a brigade to attack up Marye's Heights around noon. And this brigade, in perfect marching form, starts marching up this hill and is absolutely cut down by murderous fire from behind the stone wall, behind the sunken road, along Marye's Heights. Another brigade is ordered by General Burnside to do the same thing, up the hill, and they are cut down also. Throughout the afternoon, 14 different attacks are ordered by General Burnside. 14 times the Union men, brave beyond brave, charge up this hill. Nothing larger than a brigade, about 2,000 men, could actually do the attack because there's farmhouses and fences and rails and barns, so more men would just get stuck. So Burnside sends them one brigade at a time up this ridge. There's clearly no imagination here. There's no, it's a disaster. It is a gloriously brave, futile disaster for the North. 14 brigades attack up that slope 14 times, including the Irish brigade. The Irish participated in the Civil War in huge numbers. The pay was good. The experience was positive. Some of them got right off the boat and right to a recruiting station, and they were in the army. Mostly for the North. There were Irish soldiers for the South also. And it largely helped to assimilate the Irish into America. That, last block we talked a lot about anti-Irish bias and those anti-Irish cartoons. The Irish brigades in the Civil War went a long way to kind of making the Irish American. That people, went to war with the Irish, realized they were just as brave and normal as everybody else. And it really helped Americans lose their anti-Irish bias, and it helped make the Irish full citizens of the United States. But the Irish Brigade charged up this hill at Marye's Heights and was cut down. As night fell, General Burnside's aides begged him to call off the attack. And you got to give Burnside a little bit of credit at least, that he said, first thing in the morning, I'm going to personally lead a charge. He felt terrible. He was personally going to lead an attack up the hill himself, but he was dissuaded from doing so. In one of the awful scenes of the Civil War, all night, and the night fell, it's November, it's cold, thousands of wounded men are laying here on this field, and no one can get to them. Someone pops their head up and bang, the Confederates are firing at them. All night, thousands of wounded Union troops just lay on the battlefield. No one can get to them. And they're moaning for water, and you can hear them dying. They start screaming loud, and the screams get lower and softer, and then it's everyone who was there, who kind of left a remembrance of the battlefield, said that night was so terrible, because just the sounds of the wounded that no one could get to made an impression on everybody who was there. The next day, Burnside withdraws his troops back to the northern side of the river and is forced to beg General Lee for a truce so he can collect his wounded. And General Lee, graceful, gracious, chivalrous as always, agreed. The Battle of Fredericksburg, you can see the casualty totals. The North took twice as many casualties as the South. And the results. The South rejoices. This is a huge victory. After the kind of victory at Antietam, this next attempt of the North to conquer the South, to attack the South, conquer Richmond, ended in catastrophe for the North. Lincoln comes under heavy fire, not just from Northern Democrats, but now from Republicans as well. They said, how could you have appointed this clown to be the head general? Burnside, who is normally a pretty stand-up guy, tries to blame his subordinates. There's no way around the fact that Burnside ordered 14 brigades to attack up this hill to the same result 14 times. After another attempt to rescue his name in something that became known as the Mud March in January of 1863, Burnside is removed from command, and he's like, thank God. And Joseph Hooker is appointed in his place. And the story of Fightin' Joe Hooker is the story of letter B, the Battle of Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville. And you can see it, how to spell it on the other page of the notes. Well, who's this guy that Lincoln gets to fight the next battle? Another one of the corps commanders of the Union Army, Fightin' Joe Hooker. Hooker and Burnside kind of go together because they both gave their names to something you know about. Burnside for his facial hair. Hooker, Fightin' Joe Hooker, was a brash and ill-tempered guy, not a pleasant guy necessarily to be around. He was brave enough, but not particularly well-suited for high command. He had a reputation for his appreciation, let's put it delicately. How shall we put this? That Hooker had a reputation for the appreciation of women that were not his wife. And these women would very often be around his headquarters. And that's why and where the term for a prostitute comes from General Joseph Hooker. General Hooker had publicly gone on the record and said Lincoln was a moron. He said Lincoln had no business being president of the United States. What the United States needed was a dictator, like in ancient Rome, a dictator in times of crisis to run the government and run the army, with full, total control. And strangely enough, General Hooker thought, hey, the country needs a dictator. Where shall we find one? Hey, me! I'd be the best person to run the country as a dictator. And Lincoln knew all about that. And Lincoln appoints him to command anyway. And he sent Hooker a letter upon his appointing him as general-in-chief, which reveals a lot about Lincoln's character. And we'll read the cogent part of the letter here. And Lincoln said to Hooker, I think that during General Burnside's command of the army, you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country. So Lincoln says, look, you were trying to get Burnside's job from the beginning, and it doesn't reflect well on you, and you didn't do any good for the country. And he goes on to say, I have heard in such a way as to believe it of you recently, saying that both the army and the government need a dictator. And then Lincoln said, of course it is not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you, Lincoln says to Hooker, what I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. It says a lot about Lincoln. And a lot about Hooker. So anyway, by the spring of 1863, Hooker has the largest army the Union has ever put into the field under his command. 125,000 men, ready for action. And Hooker marches his men over the Rappahannock River. He outnumbers Lee 2-1. 125,000 Union men, 60,000 Confederates. There is really no way Hooker should lose this battle. Burnside wants to cross the river, force Lee into battle, use his superior numbers to overwhelm him, use his cavalry to maneuver Lee out into the open where he will destroy him. Well, the first thing that kind of conspires against the Union is the fact that fog and rain made the cavalry ineffective, and there was no getting Lee's army out into the open. On the 1st of May, 1863, Hooker is in a good position. He has crossed the Rappahannock River. He has his troops arranged in a line going back into this part of woods called the Wilderness. And here's kind of the Union Army. He is going to take this part of the army, he wants to swing it around, and then march on Richmond. But then Hooker freezes. And this is where General Lee's genius. General Lee was an excellent tactician. General Lee was not a military genius. There are very few men in history that we can give that term to. He lost some pretty important battles, General Lee. But what made General Lee such a great general, General Lee of the South psychologically knew his opponents. And General Hooker comes off as very confident. General Hooker's like, my army's great, my army's going to win, we're going to march real fast, we're going to take care of this, we'll be in Richmond in 3 weeks, this will be over, I'm the greatest. Lee sees that, though, and he recognizes, and Lee kind of says, you know what, this is not confidence, it's bluster. In reality, Lee realizes Hooker is not confident at all. And we all have seen this sometimes. People come off as really confident, they like to make loud and brash statements, but in reality, they're insecure. And that was Hooker, and Lee knew it. So on the night of the 1st of May, Hooker, instead of continuing his attack, Hooker freezes and stops. And Lee wastes no time. He knows that Hooker is not confident enough to be aggressive. So, because Lee knows Hooker's not going to be aggressive, Lee's army, which is here, outnumbered 2-1, does not have to worry about being attacked. Lee confers with his most trusted lieutenant, General Stonewall Jackson, and decides to split the army in half. And General Jackson takes his half of the army, and on an all-day march, they leave at 7 in the morning, and all day they march all around Hooker's flank. All of these men are facing this way. They have no idea that there is a force of 30,000 Confederates in the woods behind them. There is some scattered evidence of their march. It reaches Hooker. He orders his general all the way on the right, General Howard, to be prepared. General Howard says this guy has no idea what he's talking about. He ignores them. At 5:30 in the evening, General Jackson, Stonewall Jackson's men explode out of the woods and crash into the Union right. Most of the Union troops did not even have loaded guns. They were sitting down to dinner. They had made their campfires, they had pitched their tents, they were laying around, they were smoking, they were drinking, they were playing cards, and then in one of the surreal scenes of the war, as they told it, the animals all started running out of the woods, and squirrels and raccoons and deer all of a sudden started running out of the woods, and then a few moments later, the shriek of the rebel yell came out of the woods, and these 30,000 men just swept them up before them. Howard's entire corps disintegrates. Thousands are taken prisoner. But the average Union soldier, as poorly led as he might be, is still brave. And the Union troops are fighting back hard as night begins to fall. And the very success of the attack means that the Confederate troops, by the time they've rolled up half this line, they're as disorganized as the Union troops are. By 11 at night, the whole Union right has been smashed, but Lee kind of came forward here. They were still not able to hook up. And that was Jackson's goal, to cut off this whole half of the army. He didn't quite achieve his goal. At 11 o'clock at night, General Jackson rode ahead with his staff to see if a night attack was feasible. Jackson was so aggressive, he wanted to fight in the middle of the night. It was a full moon, so it was light enough to do so, theoretically. But Jackson goes out with a few staff people further than any other Confederate troops. And upon returning, he is fired upon by his own pickets, by his own kind of guard. Like the army always has people kind of out in front guarding the army. And General Pickett, because he was coming from where Union troops would have been, was fired on by his own troops. Jackson is hit 3 times, including twice in the arm and once in the hand. The arm was amputated the next day. He was on his way to recovery, where he could have been just as fine a general with one arm. There was plenty of one-armed generals in the army by 1863. One-leg generals. Some generals had a missing arm and a leg, and they strapped themselves onto their horses. Certainly happened. But Jackson developed pneumonia and died 10 days later. It was a crushing blow to the Confederacy. He was Lee's best soldier. Aggressive, ambitious, came up with this idea for this attack, and he died 10 days later, wounded by his own men. Well, that's a little in the future. The next day, Hooker screws up again. You can feel bad for Burnside, a little. I do. I don't feel bad for Hooker. The next day, Hooker blundered again and orders this part of the army here to retreat. Back kind of to a line like that, like a big U. And that allows General Jackson's part of the army, now I believe under the command of General Ewell, to link up with Lee.